I thought I had not. I was convinced that I'd used Sass before, but I realized in reading this chapter that I was simply using CSS variables. I thought that variables were synonymous with Sass, but I came to realize
Yeah.
that Sass has a lot more going on and also handles variables differently. How about you,
Yeah.
Russ?
I've only played with it. I was learning a little bit of something called the leprechaun thing. It's like a kind of, it's similar
Right.
to Shiny, but a very kind of trimmed down version of it, where the documentation is kind of written in a way that suggests that Sass is the best way to go about it. And a lot of it seems strange to me because there was like two different syntaxes of
Yep,
Sass.
exactly.
Um, and and like um so I went to the Sass website and found it quite confusing, to be honest, just to work out where to get started, because it seemed to be written for someone who had considerably more CSS experience than I had. Um, but after kind of battling with it, it seemed quite a nice way to work, even though you have to do additional steps, and it kind of anyway. I don't know. Would you like to? I can do an introduction if you like.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So today, well, this is a book club to work through the outstanding user interfaces with Shiny book by David Granjon. We are working through the second big section of the book, which is about CSS and styling apps and things. And today we're doing chapter 7, which is on using Sass to and kind of pre-processing to generate your CSS files. And Arthur's going to be talking through this with us. Okay, if you'd like to go on.
Thanks so much for the intro, Russ. And yeah, Lucio asked in chat if I could repeat the question about variables. Russ had basically asked if I'd ever used Sass before, and I admitted that I thought I had, but it turns out I was just using CSS as variables. I thought that variables were synonymous with Sass, but it turns out that's not the case. Anyway, I'll so kind of two things, I guess, to kind of manage expectations as we get started. Number one, as I was joking earlier, I won't rise to the high bar that Lucio set during last week's presentation. Second, I haven't had so much time to prepare this section, so you'll see me kind of darting between kind of summarizing notes here and the book itself. And then kind of third piece is I feel like what time I had, I invested mostly in trying to understand how Sass Sass, the tool outside of R, works rather than Sass the package. So I might give the latter a bit short shrift, but anyway, we'll navigate through it together. So to kind of get started, yeah, I mean, you can see the objectives here is really kind of twofold. And on the second one, I think I'll probably disappoint, even more so than on the first. So for the first, it turns out there's this tool called Sass that allows you to write CSS in perhaps a better way, and we'll see more about why it's better. So my presentation and this chapter are meant to kind of provide an overview of how that tool operates and give you an idea of some advantages that tool might offer. Now, Sass sits outside of R. It's a CSS preprocessor, and but good news is that we don't have to go outside of our tool stack as R users to use Sass, because there's this package also called Sass that allows our users to kind of have Sass work on their behalf. So the kind of short version is you pass the package some Sass code, and then Sass will write Sass the package will write your Sass the kind of tool code for you, and in turn we'll compile that into CSS. That might be a bit much for an intro, but just to give us a little bit of an idea of where we're going. So you might kind of been wondering, what is Sass? I've already kind of given an introduction to that, but let me give you kind of a complimentary one. Is, as we saw last week, and probably all know, CSS is a style sheet language, which allows you to kind of indicate for the syntactic elements within the DOM, like what styles to give to them. And Sass is also kind of a style sheet language, but it's a special kind of style sheet language in that it's a CSS preprocessor, which means that Sass allows you to write your style sheet rules in Sass, and then it being Sass translates what you've written in Sass into regular CSS. Why might you want to do that? You might be asking. That sounds like a fairly Byzantine process to kind of, write something in an abstract language that then gives you the thing that you want in the end, which is the CSS. Why? I mean, there may be many reasons. These are just kind of a few that I kind of quickly compiled. Is if you've written any CSS before, or at least if you're a kind of a CSS beginner like me, you might find that CSS can be a little tedious or repetitive to write. Oftentimes you may have several classes or several rules that kind of share a common property or set of properties, and you find yourself writing it again and again and again and again, right? And of course, if you change any of those properties in future, you need to change them again and again and again. So CSS in a certain sense isn't very dry. So DRY, don't repeat yourself. But Sass kind of has some tools that allow you to kind of limit the degree to which you repeat yourself. So if there are common properties that are used, in your style rules, then you can basically have those effectively like captured in one place and then shared throughout the rest of your code. So that's a really nice feature. The other feature, and there are many others, that's kind of interesting is, and I don't know how much this is actually true anymore, but the book says that with CSS you can't perform computations. I think actually you can now. Lucy and others might be able to correct this, but in any event, one advantage of Sass is that it has some simple math operations that may be compelling. So for example, if you wanted to compute the width, let's say, of some like child element that sits within, a parent element, then maybe you could perform some computations to define that width exactly, right, as a function of the parent element size, for example. Or if you wanted to compute a color, maybe you could perform some operations to make changes on some color. I don't know if that actually, let's see. Okay, actually, yeah, Lucia just dropped in the chat. There's a calc, I guess, function in CSS now, and maybe it's been
Yes,
there for a
there are
while.
many. Yes, there are many operations that one can perform in CSS. There are also like max or main functions, and even this year the cosine and sine functions have been added as well.
Oh, cool, very cool. So this may not be as a compelling of like a reason to use Sass as it was in the past. And actually, I've got a little link in the notes, which I haven't posted yet. But this is kind of an overview of Sass, which kind of gives you an idea in a little bit more detail of what it does and gives you some of the kind of compelling features. We're going to go over most of these in turn, but for those interested, this might provide a bit more content and some motivating examples. So on the why. So how does Sass do this? I mean, I'm not technically exactly, but it offers a few tools that really help you write might help you write CSS more effectively. So it has variables which help you avoid repetition. So to the extent you have certain properties that you want to kind of set once and use multiple times, you can kind of define a variable. I think pretty much anywhere within your Sass file, and then refer to that variable to utilize that underlying property. So if you wanted to have a certain color that's a key color, like a primary color you want to use in your app, you can set it equal to a variable and then invoke that variable multiple times for all of the rules or classes that need to refer to it. Turns out regular CSS also has variables that work in similar fashion. I've not looked into this deeply to see how they differ, just to flag that. Also, Sass allows you to write CSS in a way that it's not, you don't have like a monolithic style sheet. I mean, obviously, even with CSS, I think you can import multiple style sheets, right? And then there will be rules in CSS about which, where rules conflict about which rule takes precedence. But one thing that's kind of nice about Sass, or at least this is a selling point that was made in the book and also in Sass's own documentation, is that you can create what Sass calls partials. You can create separate files that may be files that are let's say sets of CSS classes or rules that might be in a thematically related area, let's say fonts, for example. And then in that way, it might be easier for you as a developer to kind of reuse those partials. So it's kind of like partial style sheets, I guess you can think of, across multiple projects, and maybe even maintain them because you're looking at them as a a little self-contained unit of things that's not part of this larger monolithic block. So in a certain sense, it has some of the same advantages, I guess, of if you're writing R to have packages, as composed to, or at the very least, instead of having thousands and thousands of lines of code in a single R function, to have several, or R script to have several scripts, or maybe even better than that, to have functions. Speaking of functions, another feature that Sass offers is that it offers two things that kind of have the same broad objective, but come to it by different means, called mix-ins and functions that in effect kind of help you write CSS in a certain way, where mix-ins, kind of at the risk of explaining this before I explain it in later section, mix-ins basically allow you to have like a set of properties, and then that you would define sort of like a variable, and then invoke them in other classes or rules later. And then with functions, you can kind of perform computations that will resolve to CSS properties. So in that way, you can kind of write your CSS in a different way that might be better than the traditional way, or easier than the traditional way. Also, one thing that's really quite interesting is that Sass offers inheritance, the offer to kind of like inherit from and extend classes. So somewhat akin to object-oriented programming, at least insofar as you can have, you can create a parent class that'll have a parent CSS class that'll have some properties, and then you can, after that, create child classes that can inherit from that parent and extend from that parent. We'll make this a bit more concrete in future. Also, within Sass, you have the ability to have kind of flow controls. So basic kind of some of the things you might expect for a programming language, where you could see if then, right? This kind of allows you to write maybe your CS in a little bit different fashion. And then also you could kind of you could have function loops or things like that might help you write your CSS through Sass, maybe in more compact, more maintainable fashion. And then last piece, and then all this is in no particular order, is Sass offers you to write kind of nested code. So we saw last week in Lucio's presentation, you can, with CSS, you can kind of, with some of the selectors, you can kind of select, let's say, an element that sits within a parent element, let's say, and you can write that in a certain fashion. But if you wanted to style the parent and you want to style the child, then you'd have to have probably two different rules. CSS allows you to write your CSS in a way that I think more mirrors the way in which HTML is written, and makes it, at least for some use cases, the CSS perhaps more readable in the sense that you can look at it and kind of understand how the overall kind of like parent element that consists of child elements is going to look, right? Well, anyway, this is a lot of hand waving, but let's just say that CSS offers a lot of different functionality that helps address maybe some of the potential shortcomings of regular CSS. It allows you to write your regular CSS in a different and maybe compelling way. So that's previously I talked about Sass, I guess, big Sass, let's call it, or the Sass, the tool, the CSS tool. Well, there's also a Sass package, maybe let's call it little Sass, that allows our users to access and utilize these tools without leaving R. So at a very high level, you can write Sass code from R. You can kind of compose it through a few R functions that Sass offers you. And then once you've composed your Sass script, you can then have R write your Sass file, and then from that Sass file write the CSS files, and then attach those CSS files if you want to your project. I'll come back to that later. So now I guess I'll go over some of these features that I described to a degree previously, and kind of the intro. I'll try to describe them in a little bit more detail as the book does, where I can, I'll offer my own examples, but more often than not, I'll be referring to examples in the book. So variables, as I was saying earlier, allow you to structure your CSS in such a way that you can sort of avoid repetition. You can create some variable that that captures a particular property. Let's imagine a color that you're going to use several times in your various CSS rules and classes. Well, you can kind of define that variable once. Let's say at the head of your code, and then refer to it many times. So in CSS, you might find something like, what does that mean? And let's look at this kind of simplistic example. Let's imagine that in CSS you wanted to have some color. Well, so here you can see we've got a paragraph tag, and then the link tag, or rather selector, I should say. And we're saying that each one of them is going to be red. Really, a very silly example. Both of them are red. Here in my code, I've had to write red twice, right? And then if I want to make changes, if I decide instead blue suits me better, then I have to go back and find every instance where I mention red and change it to blue, right? Well, in Sass, you could write your Sass file in the following fashion. So you could write a variable. So variables are kind of are identified as such because they start with a $, and basically they look in effect like a regular CSS property, but importantly don't fall within a CSS rule or CSS class. So instead they kind of sit like this. They have this kind of same structure where you have a key and a value. But here the key has a certain has a $sign at the very beginning to indicate that this is a variable, and then then you have the value that falls to the right after the colon. So here I can store the value red in my color, and then invoke it several times within my rules here. So rather than writing red, I can write $my color, and likewise down here, $ my color. So then if I come back to this and want to change it to blue, I only have to make that edit in one single place. So just change red to blue, or provide the hex or other value in one place, which is quite nice. Additionally, if you're developing some like a Sass module, let's say, that you're going to reuse in the future, if you don't want, future you or other developers, or rather, if you want future you or other developers to be able to override your default values, let's say I love red right now, but in the future I may not like red. Sorry, there's a little error here. Then you can basically write your variable declaration in this way. Write the value, and actually the exclamation point should be in front of default. It should be like this, so that you can indicate in your Sass that this is the default value of your variable, but then the end user can override that value. And just to give you, maybe for those curious, a little preview of how that works. Coming to Sass's documentation, you can use a certain module and then and provide your own values of the variables that are set as default. So here you've got kind of a library, you've got a partial that's developed, and then you have these variables here, and you'll notice that we have exclamation point default at the end of each one of these lines, so that other users can come in and utilize your CSS, but bring their own variable values. So overriding them where they want. So here for black and border radius, these two properties, in this case where it's being used, we're overriding the default values, but then accepting this box shadow property. That's kind of how it might be used in practice. The book doesn't go into any detail about this, but I just wanted to mention it because it might be useful to the extent you kind of develop your own. Let's say I could easily imagine you could develop your own, let's say, Sass partials for Shiny development, let's say. Particularly if you have maybe, let's say, a corporate branding guidelines or something to that effect. Right. So I mentioned partials just now. So what are partials? Let me actually explain them. So why might you want to use these things? Well, first, I guess a word on what they are is, as I explained kind of briefly earlier, partials. And I understood that the book, I think, if I recall directly, didn't say much about modules. I don't know if they're a distinct entity or if they're just kind of presented as a synonym for partials. But in any event, the idea is that if you're writing, let's say, plain CSS, you might have a very long style sheet that consists of rules that pertain to lots of different let's see, sets of things in your page. Let's say you have rules about buttons, you have rules about font, you have rules about well, anyway, that's enough examples. You have rules about particular things. It could be that you might want to split this kind of monolithic, like this single, very large, probably difficultly readable, difficultly maintainable CSS file into several pieces, several logical chunks that capture a set of like rules that relate to like a particular area, right? With Sass, you can create these things that are called partials that are exactly that. And how you do it is as follows. So for each partial, you're going to create a file that starts with underscore. So we saw in this example earlier, we had some file called underscore library.scss. So this is one of, Russ mentioned at the beginning of the call, the different syntaxes for the two different syntaxes for Sass. I think the most commonly used one, at least from what I think they said in the documentation, is it's the .scss format. That's the most commonly used one. Anyway, you'll have a file that starts with underscore, and then it is a Sass file. So it's going to be, I guess, Sass CSS, CSS. And then when Sass is doing its work of pre-processing, of basically kind of looking at your Sass files and then converting it accordingly into CSS, it's going to look for all the files that start with underscore, and that's how Sass will recognize them as partials. Also, with partials, partials may exist, but they need, in a sense, to be like imported. You need to have some, let's say, master Sass file, main Sass file that uses all of the that uses all the partials that you need, let's say, for a particular project, right? In the book, they talk about using them, like importing them through this @import directive, but actually, I out of curiosity, I started looking at the Sass documentation around this, and quickly discovered that actually Sass now says to use the @use directive instead. And in fact, that as you can read here, that the @import directive might be deprecated, like entirely removed from the language in the future. So to kind of get a sense of how this might work, or at least maybe to make this a little more concrete, I'll just jump to this example within the book, which doesn't go into the definitions of partials, but shows you how they might, gives you kind of a flavor for how they might be used. So if you look at the Bootstrap, for example, Bootstrap is some, I think they're saying here, 10,000 lines of code. If you look at just the regular Bootstrap library, but if you split it into the SCSS, then you can see that it actually breaks all of these sets of rules into files, so partials that pertain to certain thematic or functional areas. So you'll have a set of functions, for example, that you can import into the project, a set of variables, mixins, which we'll come to shortly, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. So in that way, you can have some, let's say, main Sass file that imports and composes your Sass project by referring to sets of partials. Yeah, that's how it works in Sass.
So in
sure.
that you were importing a user specified file rather than a module that is sort of internal to Sass. Is that right? So import functions, it's not importing a module that allows you to define functions that's written in the base Sass.
Yeah, that's a great question, Russ. I mean, my understanding is that these are user-written partials that you or I would compose for our own purposes. And indeed, like Sass seems to talk about modules, at least in their documentation. There's this built-in modules, so there's some modules that exist. I've not looked into them, and the book doesn't talk about them. So these might be, yeah, I'm not sure what these are. Exactly, but my understanding, at least from this, is that with this import, you're importing your own Sass files that you're bringing to the project, not some kind of Sass's library of partials. Yeah. Again, that's my understanding, which could well be completely wrong, or at least partial, unintended. Right. So that's on partials. So in a way, like partials, at a minimum, allow you to perhaps like better organize your CSS, and I think this partials would probably be useful to the extent your project is large and complex. Might be overkill to the extent your project is simple. but it allows you a nice way to organize your work, just as maybe in an R project you might have R script 1, R script 2, R script 3, and each one of those scripts does a particular thing, right? Or thinking about R packages, you have R scripts that define functions that are about a particular area, right? So it allows you to organize things better. I don't know enough about CSS to know how much this is useful as compared to base CSS. I mean, my understanding is that one could import several style sheets. I don't see any reason why those style sheets couldn't be grouped in the way that Sass is suggesting. I don't know, maybe others with more experience could say.
Well, I think the issue is that the files that you're importing there are, many of them are involved in the creation of the CSS file that you will include with your app or your project or whatever. So yeah, certainly you can decompose your CSS files into from broad to narrow scope or something like that, if you've got a kind of firm-wide style sheet, and then something more specific to the particular app that you're working on, but and import them in turn. I think the difference here is that these are kind of decomposing the logic to create those CSS files rather than decomposing the CSS files themselves. I don't know whether that makes sense, but
no, that definitely makes sense, Russ. I mean, I guess in my mind, I still had this kind of loose, like one-to-one relationship. I mean, much as what you say is true. I mean, still, like let's imagine you could have a file on fonts that would be in Sass that would contain the logic for creating the CSS file that is about fonts, or at least the content that's about fonts. But in the same way, you could have just a fonts CSS file, for example.
Yeah.
Anyhow, interesting, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, for this, I think I need probably more experience, or actually read experience, not the more qualifier, to really discern like how useful this is. I mean, I kind of look at it and I think, yeah, neat. But I'm not. Yeah, we'll see. Coming now to the other parts. So I mentioned previously. So Sass has these two these kind of two ways in which you could maybe write CSS more conveniently, in addition to those that we've already seen. So the first is mixins. And mixins, I guess you can kind of understand them, or at least I understand them as a template for CSS. So let's imagine you have a set of properties you intend to reuse, and perhaps there's a changeable component of those properties. Let's imagine that you have some set of properties, and then that you want to reuse multiple times for, let's say, different classes you'll create. But then the color of the text may vary from one class to the next, and maybe that's the point of those classes, that you have the red class, the green class, the blue class, etc. And mixins offers you a way to reuse those properties, and then at the same time bring in that variable component. So if it's as in the example I kind of described, if it's color, you can kind of have almost like a pseudo function, let's say, or maybe think better. Maybe the better mental model would be glue. Like let's imagine you're writing CSS with the R package glue. You could just kind of write in the color where it needs to be, and then the rest of kind of your thing would be maintained. And what's interesting is it's almost a pseudo function in the sense like you have a template, you provide the template with some arguments, although I think you don't have to have arguments, but you may have arguments, and then it returns CSS. And that CSS could kind of populate your class definition. When you define a mixin, you're going to use this @mixin declaration, and then when you use a mixin as you're composing your CSS classes or rules, you use this @include directive. So let's look at the book. They have actually a nice example here. So here they have some rule here about transforming kind of rotating by 90 degrees something some element on the page, and let's imagine that really like what you want to do, here you have 90 degrees rotation, there you're going to have 45 degrees, etc. You're going to have different rotations in different spots, but the underlying logic is the same. You're going to have this rotation occur, and you want to make this reusable. So you could have this declaration, so @mixin, create let's say a mixin, think function, called transform. That's a name you provide, and then optionally some set of arguments. Looks a lot like an R function kind of, and then here in this particular case, you can see that this within the scope of this mixin, you have this variable property, right? This argument property whose value will be substituted, just kind of through almost string interpolation, like substituted where you find the $ property. So if you wanted to create, some class from this mixin, you could do it in this way. So element1, and then use include. So remember, use mixin to define the mixin, include to include it, and then in this case, since the mixin expects a property, you provided a property, so rotate 90 degrees. And then what this will yield is the following. So you'll end up, Sass will write for you following CSS. Element1, and then you can see here that you've got WebKit transform, rotate 90 degrees, Microsoft transform, rotate 90 degrees, transform, etc. So where you have this 90 degrees featuring several times. Yeah, so it's a nice way in which you can maybe write your CSS more compactly by identifying places where there's repetition. When your kind of R function spider sense is tingling, that's maybe when a mixin might be a potential solution. Yeah.
Sure,
Go ahead,
sure.
Russ.
I was just wondering about the terminology. Mixins, it's something I know of from Python programming, where like unlike R, if you have a class defined in Python, it's hard to add extra methods to it. And they have something called a mixin, which allows you to basically do that, where I really don't know the actual ins and outs of how it works, but it's a way of adding additional methods to a class that already exists.
Interesting.
And it looks a kind of similar idea here, where you're like the class is the kind of selector that you're defining, and the mixin is being used to add kind of additional like repeated set of functions to that. I don't know how it works when you compose these mixins though, because presumably like if you modified WebKit transforming two separate mixins and then included them both in here.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder precisely what order things happen, or whether one supersedes the other or something like that. But yeah, no, it's quite interesting.
Oh, that's really interesting, Russ. I know very little about Python, so that's kind of interesting that you have a similar idea here, which I mean may also exist separate from Python and be inspired from, have like another parent, I guess, like intellectual parent. Yeah, that's interesting. So that's on mixins. Another thing that I guess kind of fits in the same thematic group insofar as it helps you maybe more deftly like compose or compose a CSS class or rules with lesser effort perhaps is functions. So functions, help you perform calculations, simple mathematical operations, which I guess maybe at the time of writing of this book, this claim was true. It was not possible in CSS, seems now it is. And like mixins in a certain sense, it returns well, actually differently from mixins. So mixins, my mental model is sort of copy paste, or R's glue. Here it's more a function in the sense that it performs a computation and returns a value, and that value, at least in the case that's shown in the book, I don't know more broadly for Sass, but can be a property, right? That you'll use in your CSS rule. And to define it, you'll have this @function directive, kind of akin to the @mixin directive. And then when you invoke the function, you simply use the name of the function and provide, if applicable, any arguments. So to the example from the book, which is kind of an interesting one. Let's see, right. So maybe I pointed to the wrong spot. Apologies for that. Yeah, I think it was this example that I had in mind. So here, kind of the wrapping is Sass, the package, the R package. But if you kind of look internally here, this is Sass. So you have this function that whose name is multiply. So you have the @function declaration, multiply with param1 and param2. You can optionally have these debugging arguments that will help with debugging, although the book doesn't say much how, and shame on me, I didn't really look. But here, as you might expect for a function, you have a return command, and then return the value of param1 times param2. So how might that be useful? Maybe you want to compute the width of something. So you have this class width, and then you invoke multiply, where you multiply a times b times one pixel, where we've defined these variables. These are Sass variables, named variables a and b. 2 and 4, so 2 times 4 is 8 times 1 is 1 pixel. So you can compute 8 pixels in this case is the width. So this is the CSS that would result from this Sass. Russ, Lucio, Trevin, is this also possible within CSS, vanilla CSS? I've not used the calc command.
I am not sure if you can multiply in CSS. I would guess that you can.
Okay.
And let me check. I will keep looking at it, and I will mention you in the chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lucio. So this is how functions work. Might be useful in certain cases. Right. Let me move on. Sorry, this is kind of a long chapter, so I'm probably going to end up running short on time here. The other thing I mentioned earlier is that in sort of pseudo, object-oriented programming fashion, Sass offers, the ability for one to, when composing classes, to use inheritance and extension that you might expect from an object-oriented programming. So you can create some base class or parent class. And when you do so, like you intend it to be a parent class. In its definition, you'll have this percentage sign that precedes it. Then you'll have its definition, and then you can create a child class that. Oh, interesting. Thanks, Lucio. Lucio in chat mentioned that that kind of the addition, subtraction, multiplication, division are supported by the calc function in CSS. So I guess vanilla CSS is caught up with Sass, at least from my basic understanding. So you can create this parent class and then create a child class. And in the child class's definition, you can explicitly say that it extends. So you can kind of extends the parent class. So basically, it'll inherit, as you might expect, it'll inherit the attributes of the parent class, and then you can extend, and even overwrite some of the properties of the parent class. So this is how it looks. Let's imagine that you're going to have alerts in your app. Some alerts are good, some alerts are bad. Red alerts are bad, green alerts are good, let's imagine. But alerts share some common properties, right? Position, padding, margin, etc. So you have these common properties, and actually here you can see these would actually be CSS Sass variables since they start with the $sign. And anyway, this is kind of a core definition of alerts, right, as a parent class. And then your intention is to create, child classes that inherit from this, but extend the parent class. So you want to have a red alert. So you're going to have this @extend, or sorry, I should say first, notice I know this is a parent class because it has the percentage sign at the beginning of the class definition. So it's a special class. Doesn't start with dot, starts with percentage sign. And then when I'm creating my child class that extends, my extension class, I have this @extend directive, and then I refer to the parent class in the same way in which it was defined. So with this, the reference is this percentage sign and the name of the parent class. So in effect, like this red alert will inherit all of these properties, plus it'll have the font color be red, right? Or have the color red. And likewise with the green class, I can create this green class that extends this parent class. So it'll inherit all these properties, and then it'll be green on top of it. So in that way, let's just imagine that these variables were these variables are provided. Actually, are they provided anywhere? I don't see them here. Anyway, let's imagine the variables are provided in Sass, and so this would be the CSS that would result from that. So you'd have this. It would write a CSS that you would imagine. So you'd have these two classes, comma separated, class 1, comma class 2. So green, comma red, share common attributes as you might write in CSS, and then additionally you have these other rules here, or the kind of the other parts of the class definition that are particular to that class, right? So you avoided for yourself maybe having to write this, and you just write this more abstract thing where you write the parent, and then the child. Kind of an interesting way of doing things. I assume, I don't remember reading the book, but I assume that if you as you extend the class, I assume that you would be able to you'd be able to maybe even overwrite some of the parents' properties, but I didn't see that in the book, and I didn't have time to look at the Sass definition. But I would kind of imagine that if
it would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if like the metaphor extends, upon I guess intended, extends fully, then yeah, maybe you could do the same. Inheritance, flow control. Yeah, I'll just I don't have much time, so I'll just kind of go quickly through this part. Suffice and go to the book. So you can write here. So this happens to be a mix-in, but let's say if the color is red, then I want the red box shadow. If the color is green, then I want a green a box shadow that would complement green. I think this is probably green. So I've got this mix-in, and then I can include the mix-in, add shadows in my definitions of the alerts. And so this is kind of continuing from our previous example about the alert boxes. And then CSS will write the appropriate, or say Sass will write the appropriate CSS for us. So it can discern that the color is red, the property, the color is red within this class definition, and then it'll execute this if. So if red, then here's the box shadow, and if green, then here's the box shadow, which is really kind of neat. And then you can also do loops. So I'll jump over this part, but maybe kind of the two nice features about this is the structure of them is pretty much the same as you'll find for CSS loops, or sorry, JavaScript loops rather. And then the other thing is you can do string interpolation as you're doing looping. So kind of think about glue, where string interpolation is signaled by this kind of the pound sign, and then you can substitute the name in here. So maybe you wanted to kind of loop through green and red as the colors of alert boxes, and you could set up a common thing and loop through, and then actually pass even to the class names. You use string interpolation to give it a class name that corresponds to the color you want to use. So that could be very convenient. The last feature that I think I'll have time to cover, and maybe we can in a few moments go to the actual R part. It is nested code. So, as I was describing earlier with CSS, if you have maybe a structure where you have, like a paragraph tag that sits within a particular div to describe, the rules, you'd say, well, this div has this background color and this paragraph has this color. You would write it in this fashion, where you'd have this kind of parent, this kind of selector at play. It's a little verbose, perhaps, or at least there seems like there's some repetition. Also, it's a little difficult just reading the CSS to discern kind of how the thing is going to look. If you have an idea, or you can see along, in parallel, the HTML, how the thing's going to look. With Sass, you can actually write Sass in nested fashion. So you can write kind of your div right here. And then you can write the property of the div, and then you say the paragraph tag that sits within the div has this. So if you're just reading this, you can kind of see that this, for this entity, kind of how it's going to be styled. It might be a convenient way of doing things. And Sass will oh, interesting. So Lucio just said that starting 2 weeks ago, Google Chrome supports CSS nesting. I'll have to look at that, which may be, I guess, a newer CSS that's supported by Chrome. I don't know which other browsers support it, but this is maybe kind of convenient. The book does note, or maybe it was the Sass documentation, says don't make your nesting too deep. Might be kind of hard to follow. But what's nice is that Sass generates the corresponding CSS. It'll basically create the CSS for you. So if your mind works in this way, this might be a better way in which to create to write your CSS through Sass.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the great benefits of Sass is that the CSS that it outputs at the end is compatible across, if not all browsers, a great deal of the current browsers. Whereas, I mean, Lucio's just mentioned that you can do CSS nesting in Google Chrome, but presumably you won't be able to do that in all browsers for quite a while, or possibly ever, really. Certainly not for very, Internet Explorer or anything like that. That's unsupported. But the CSS that Sass outputs would be supported. And similarly, you might not be able to do calculations in CSS in some browsers, but you will be able to use calculations performed while creating CSS from Sass
Yep.
across many browsers. But
yeah, you'll get like the calculated results
Yeah.
instead of forcing the browser,
I do,
which may not
however,
support the calculations
Yeah.
to do it.
I do worry though that it might be pretty hard to debug Sass.
Hmm.
When it's because you might be able to find you you, you might be able to find an inappropriately applied style by working in dev tools on your app or something like that, but then not necessarily be able to work back to which part of the Sass that you wrote was responsible for generating that.
Yeah. So for that, Russ, there's this is a topic that's going to come up in the future, I believe. Let's see if I can quickly find where this sits, but basically you can create I think it's called a source map or something like that, where you can actually see in dev tools the corresponding Sass. So I think you can kind of see the compiled CSS, so kind of the CSS is created by Sass as well as the Sass. So I think there's this mapping between between the two, so you can you can do it, but I mean still I think some measure of your concern still remains, at least to my mind, because then you have to figure out like, well, why is Sass giving me the CSS, right?
I was also wondering, and it's less of a concern to be honest, whether Sass and similar kind of solutions like this, whether they might generate CSS files that are much bigger than they actually need to be for the app that you're styling.
So I don't know. This will only partially address your concern, but at least with the Sass, with the Sass package, and I presume with Sass the tool, one can generate a minified version of your CSS. I think that only maybe partially gets at your concern, because it may still generate Sass, CSS that's verbose, like needlessly verbose, because of the way that it translates. The Sass translates
I just
from
thought that there
Sass to
might be
CSS.
like a combinatorial explosion of things that might end up getting generated when all the possible classes and all the possible mixins are merged together.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I do think that that's the case, because as I was looking at possible reasons in order to drop a preprocessor like Sass, because as we have seen in this chapter, many of the advantages that it gives us, they are now available in CSS, and many of the comments did say that the files produced by Sass tend to be very big, and even in the minified version. So maybe it is quite a common occurrence, what you mentioned, Russ.
And then additionally, like an additional concern for us is, I guess, Shiny developers, is that, you'd have to compile your Sass at some point in your project, right? So in the best of cases, you compile it before your app ships, and basically it generates CSS that you bundle into your app. Or in the worst of cases, it's something that it's a process that needs to be executed. Basically, the compilation of CSS code from Sass needs to happen before your Shiny app loads. So that could even make your Shiny app, from the user perspective, be slower still, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are things. I know that Leprechaun does it, at least. I imagine Golem will do something similar, where you can load a dev version of an app, which will newly generate the CSS files that are required from your Sass files
Yep.
prior to loading your app for, when you're like locally looking at stuff.
Yeah, and so this exists within the Sass, the package, where you can kind of not, Sass is lazy, I guess, in the sense that it'll do the, here as it says, like a minimum amount of work on first compilation, but
okay.
the problem may be that as you're making changes to CSS, it may not, the changes may not kind of percolate down to your CSS. You have to make Sass kind of very eager to regenerate.
Yeah. And it's actually quite easy to set up a kind of tool, a set of build tools in a JavaScript project to ensure that, the Sass is all converted and things like that are all done prior to submission, prior to making a pull request or whatever. Whether I don't know whether the kind of, oh no, I guess Webpack probably will be discussed because it's on the front page of the book. It's in the figure on the title page. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. I guess we
it
really
would
ought to
be,
wrap up sometime soon. But sorry,
but what
Lucy.
you mentioned would be also the same that happens for the JavaScript code of an application, right? Because I mean, probably most front-end developers, when they write JavaScript, they are actually writing in TypeScript. So it also needs a conversion in order for the browser to recognize the code. So probably it's the same type. Well, maybe not the same type of bundling, but also some bundling for Sass and for TypeScript prior to building the application.
Yeah. Oh, it's. I think we might have to leave it there, Arthur. Is that okay? I know that
No,
there's
that's fine.
additional bits on.
Yeah,
like
for sadly, I have to say for I guess an R4DS Book Club, I should have talked about the package, but I got so interested in Sass itself, like that I didn't. But luckily it looks like it's pretty simple. So yeah, it's a very thin kind of layer separating you from Sass.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thanks for taking us through that chapter. Oh, sorry, have I bullied Internet Explorer in a meeting chat? I apologize, Internet Explorer lovers. Right, great. Well, anyway, I will see you all next week to talk about, I think it's a package called Fresh, which is a styling package, I think. But I've never used Fresh, so I look forward to learning about that next week. Okay, cool. Thanks everyone for coming along. And yeah, if anyone's watching on YouTube or whatever, you're welcome to join us. This is a book club run through the R for Data Science Slack channel. You can find us online, and yeah, come and join us if you want. Okay. Right. Okay. Bye everyone. I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.